the person that would really face the media, be a face of Chippendales. And it worked really well because he had a way bigger personality than Steve that really worked to his advantage. Nick lived for the spotlight and Steve hated it. So it was kind of a good mix. But then people started calling Nick the founder of Chippendales, which in reality, he had only been hired to do choreography and take up the entertainment value. And of course, because Steve Banerjee had such a fragile ego, the idea that Nick was getting the attention for Chippendales really started to eat at him. He felt like he wasn't getting the attention that he deserved, wasn't getting the credit for the phenomenon that was the Chippendales. So that's where the tension between Nick and Steve really started to boil. There had always been a little bit of competition and like slight disagreements on things along the way, but at this point, their relationship became toxic because the more Nick would take the spotlight, the angrier Steve would become. And eventually, Steve really was kind of invisible in the public eyes when it came to Chippendales. Chippendales became known as Nick's show, and eventually he made it pretty clear that he thought it was his show too. There was also major disagreements between the two of them about how they should go about hiring their talent. Nick really wanted people who were skilled in dance, could follow choreography, and perform well, while Steve was much more focused on just getting the hottest dudes that he could find. To him, it didn't really matter if they could dance that well or had a good stage presence or could kind of build up a character. To him, he just wanted them to look good in a thong. So eventually, it was really no secret within the Chippendales that Nick and Steve hated each other.
They saw things differently. Nick came from what's best for the production. Steve came from what pretty boy is going to sell more calendars. I don't care if he can't dance.
And on top of all this tension and drama between Steve and Nick, the club itself had drawn some very negative attention in the early 80s when it became very clear that the Chippendales was radically discriminating against guests. So as I mentioned earlier, initially the Chippendales was a female-only club. However, eventually Steve ended up opening the bar during after hours to both men and women because the bar sales were a great source of revenue. But Steve was absolutely ruthless and straight discriminatory when deciding who was allowed in as far as men go. It became very obvious very quickly that Steve was only allowing in white men. It turns out he actually thought that people of color could scare the women. Yeah. And Steve knew this was racist, and he didn't care. He didn't care about anything but money. That is, until he got caught doing it. Don Gibson, who is a second-year law student at UCLA, wanted to check out Chippendales during the after hours, so he and a friend named Barry went there. But when they got there, they were told by security that they had been denied entry because they didn't have a membership card. They said that this was apparently required for entry. Now, it's important to note that Don is black and his friend Barry is white. So the bouncer tells them that if they want to get into the club, they're going to have to go to this other building like down the street and get a membership card, which was a couple $100 each. So essentially, he made it seem kind of impossible to get this membership card. And initially, Don didn't think too much of this encounter. All he knew is he was not going to pay a couple $100 for a membership card, so he just kind of let it go and went on with his night. It wasn't until a few weeks later that he runs into Barry, who had actually gotten into Chippendales on his own without a membership card, and that's when it all clicked. It wasn't about a membership card. Don and Barry were initially denied entrance to Chippendales because Don is black. So he ended up devising a plan with two of his white friends, and the three of them got all dressed up to attend Chippendales for the night. And when they got to the club, Don, yet again, was denied entry because he didn't have the membership card. But then after that, he watched his friends get let right in without their membership card. So just a few minutes after that, his friends obviously come back out and they meet outside to discuss. His friends had gotten their hand stamps, they had proof that they had been let in, and the three of them ended up getting back in the line and going right back up to the bouncer and confronting him, saying, "You didn't let me in because I'm black, and you let my two white friends in." Of course, the bouncer was quick to deny it. He said it wasn't because of his skin color, it was because he didn't have a membership card. But he was there with his two white friends who had just been let in with stamps on their hands and they did not have this card. So the bouncer was caught in a lie, and now Don had what he needed for a discrimination case. So Don filed his complaint that Chippendales was racially discriminating against men of color, and an investigation was started. But Steve and Chippendale's lawyers continuously denied these allegations, even though Don had proof, and many others had come forward with similar stories. But in the weeks that Don was waiting to hear back from state agencies about the investigation, he ended up getting a call from a car rental company. They called him because they found a file in one of their rental cars, and it mentioned Don's name in it. And after he went in and picked up the papers, he realized that they were left behind in the rental car by a private investigator, which, good job, dude. But this investigator had been hired by Chippendales to follow Don. And not only were they following Don, Steve had also set up a sex worker to meet up with Don and frame him with drugs. He was hoping this would work as blackmail, that he could pressure Don into dropping all of the claims about racism at Chippendales and kind of clear their name. And if that wasn't enough to freak him out, then Don gets a call from a dancer at Chippendales. His name was Hadari, and he was the only black dancer to work at Chippendales. And Hadari told Don that he felt like he needed to tell him that his life may be in danger. Hadari said that he actually heard Steve say that it would be in his best interest if Don was gone. Now, he didn't specifically say what he meant by gone, but Hadari just knew by the type of guy that Steve was that he meant dead. It sort of became the norm that Steve would threaten anyone who dared to cross him or challenge the Chippendales and all the success and money he was bringing in. So Don and his lawyer end up suing Steve in a federal class action lawsuit. And in the end, Steve ended up having to pay Don $10,000 and also pay out $85,000 in damages to other people that he discriminated against. And also at this time, he agreed to hire more black dancers. Now, I think he got off way too easily here, but let's continue because it just gets worse. So yes, there were a lot of legal battles being fought in the early 80s for Chippendales, but the club was still bringing in tons of money. And in 1983, Steve was raking in $8 million a year from the club. So at this point, Steve decided it was time to take Chippendales to New York City, finally the way he had always wanted to, and he was going to have Nick do this. Sending Nick to New York was supposed to help grow the business and bring Steve in more money, but it was actually going to get Nick out of his face as well, which he wanted. The fighting between the two of them was just starting to get out of hand. They disagreed on everything. They had completely different visions and different goals. But despite all of their disagreements, Chippendales in New York was an overnight success. All the buzz from the West Coast had made its way to the East, and women were already lined up that first night to see the Chippendale dancers perform in the New York club. New York also brought in a lot of celebrities, which really boosted the media attention dramatically. Nick had been workshopping the show so that when the dancers started in New York, they were performing all new acts this time that were bigger and better than his previous work in LA, and he was super excited about it. The Chippendale men also started getting featured on some of the biggest daytime talk shows as well, and they had them perform right on daytime live TV, and people loved it.
Swimwear by Jimmy Z. Now these are the shorts that can be worn for volleyball playing on the beach. And again, what's important about them is the fibers give them the ability to dry very quickly. Let's take a look at Kevin and citrus detail on the side. Another hot look for the 50s. And here comes Gary in pink and black.
And of course, Nick, who was really seen as the founder of Chippendales at this point and loved the attention, was always there for whatever appearance they had, standing by proud. And anytime he could get camera time or be part of the interviews, he would jump for that chance. He really took ownership. He really acted like he was proud of his work and his creation, so anyone watching just figured he was the founder. And he never really hesitated to claim responsibility for the success and the birth of Chippendales, even though it was really Steve Banerjee who had started it all. And of course, this made Steve really pissed. So just because they were on two different sides of the country now did not mean that the fighting between them ever stopped. And eventually it got to the point where the two of them were just barely speaking unless they had to for business reasons, because it just became so hostile. And then there was one event that really drove the final wedge between Nick and Steve. And this was something known as the napkin deal, which happened in 1984. Steve and Nick decided to meet up at a restaurant, see if they could kind of work on their differences, kind of ease the tension a little bit, and see if they could continue working together as business partners long term. So they met up at this restaurant, and they were joined by another Chippendales dancer, Dan Peterson. And apparently as soon as they sat down, they were at each other's throats. First of all, Nick wanted more compensation because he felt like he had been a huge part of the newfound success of Chippendales and making it really what it was today. He wanted to be recognized for all of the hard work that he had put in and the success that he had brought to the brand, but Steve was not into that. Giving up some of his profits to Nick just wasn't gonna fly for him. So then Nick comes up with a plan, and he convinces Steve to sign the famous napkin deal. He told Steve that he would give him 50% of the profits from the New York club, but that he has the right to take Chippendales on the road. And he also wrote, "I own this in perpetuity." Nick just knew that if he took the Chippendales on tour, it would be incredibly profitable. And when he proposed this idea to Steve, he just knew that that success was going to be there. So he literally writes down this deal on a cocktail napkin. And Steve ends up signing it because he does not think that Chippendales on tour will do well at all. He doesn't care. And also, he didn't know at the time what in perpetuity actually meant, which it means forever. And he didn't know this, but he had just legally signed a binding document that grants Nick half of the profits from the New York club and all of the profits for Chippendales on tour. Forever. And so Nick gets the tour going, and it doesn't take long for the word to get out that Chippendales is going on tour. The first show took place in Philadelphia, followed by Atlantic City, and it was even more successful than Nick had imagined because instead of performing for a few hundred women, they were able to secure venues for thousands of women. So as you'd expect, a lot of money started coming in through these tours, and the touring Chippendale dancers were performing twice a night with only one day off. And as soon as he saw the success and money that was coming from the tours, Steve started to feel like Nick had betrayed him, taken what was rightfully his. And he also started believing that Nick was withholding profits from him as well. And by the mid-'80s, the touring profits were reaching up to $80,000 a week. But Steve really had one saving grace on his side, and that was the Chippendales calendar. The first Chippendales calendar came out in 1981, and pretty much every year since, it gained insane popularity and got bigger and bigger every year. The first year, they printed 100,000 copies, and eventually they would start printing up to more than 1 million copies a year. And even though Steve was producing these calendars and making insane amounts of money doing it, he was still just fuming every day at the idea that Nick had tricked him into signing over the profits for the Chippendales tour. And then in 1986, Steve really fucked up. You see, Steve was in charge of taking a look at the final draft of the calendar, seeing if there were any mistakes before it was sent off to printing. And if you remember, he had actually grown up in a family printing business, so it was a big part of his life, and so he wanted to be the one to approve the final version. However, in 1986, he did a really rushed job looking things over, and there were quite a few mistakes. Their huge shipment of calendars comes in, and some kid actually comes flying into Steve's office and tells him there's a mistake. Right off the bat, when he looks, there are 31 days in February. Now, we all know February has only 28 days, so you can't sell a calendar that has the wrong amount of days in a month. I mean, you just can't do it. But Steve had an absolute panic because this was all out of his pocket, and he was going to lose $700,000 over it, so he tried everything he could think of to see if there was a way they could still sell these calendars. He even at one point wanted to get stickers and kind of replace the numbers and make it work, because May also had the incorrect number of days as well, but none of that was going to work. They realized that these calendars could not be sold. So at this point, his anger was at an all-time high. I mean, he had just made this massively expensive mistake, and meanwhile, Nick is just raking it in. He's on top of the world, and Steve feels like all of that really belongs to him. So Steve decides that he is just going to go ahead and start his own tour. So he gets his own group of dancers, and they hit the road. He was hoping that this could help him make the money back from the calendar fiasco, and make even more in the future. But based on the original napkin deal, Nick was the only one who was allowed to take the Chippendales show on tour. He found out pretty much right away what Steve was doing, and he ended up going to court and getting an order that would forever shut down Steve's rival Chippendales tour. And I'm sure we can all guess how Steve Banerjee felt about this. He had lost major profits from this napkin deal. He had lost thousands of dollars from the calendar mistakes, and now Nick had made sure that Steve would never take Chippendales on the road. So that's when Steve Banerjee finally hit his breaking point. He was fed up with Nick stealing the spotlight on what he felt like he had truly created. He was mad that he was getting all the attention and credit for it, and he was mad that he was making money off what he thought was rightfully his. So on the morning of April 7th, 1987, Steve was in LA, per usual, and Nick was in his office in New York. Nick and his two co-workers, Will and Robin, were at the office at 9 a.m. There was a client meeting that was scheduled for later that morning in a different office that Will was supposed to attend, but he wasn't feeling well, so Robin decided to go. And not long after she left, a man came into their office on the 15th floor. This man was described as Hispanic, around 5'8", 35 years old, wearing jeans and a brown tannish jacket. First, he walks in and spots Will, and he goes up to him and asks if he is Nick DeNoia. And he says no, but he's right over there. He points over to Nick's office, which is over in the back. This man walks back to Nick's office, walks in, and a few seconds later, Will hears a gunshot. And then the door just quietly opening and closing once again, and the man left. He ran into Nick's office and found him with a gunshot to the head, and he was just slumped over in his office chair.
Man has been shot in the head in my office.
Nick was pronounced dead that same morning, and the investigation into who killed him began. At first, police started trying to figure out a motive for this crime. I mean, it's pretty obvious this was a direct personal hit that was done very quickly and in an organized way. I mean, it just didn't make sense for it to be like a robbery or something random like that, since this guy had gone up 15 floors and asked for Nick by name. I mean, it was clearly a personal hit. Now, keep in mind, Nick had a lot of people who just didn't like him. A lot of the people that worked at Chippendales, I mean, he could be really, really tough on them. So when police came in to interview the Chippendales dancers, they asked them who they thought would, want to kill Nick DeNoia and why. And a lot of them kind of said that who wouldn't want to kill Nick? I know it sounds awful, but I mean, person after person just told the police that he had pushed so many people so hard and had been rude to several people along the way, and he wasn't well liked. But of course, the police have to figure out who exactly it was. They have to do their due diligence and go through everybody and figure out who has it out for Nick the most. And so the investigation kind of jumped from one motive to the next. At first, they actually thought it was some type of crime of passion, like a lover's triangle, something like that. Then they started thinking that maybe this crime was entirely related to the mob. And when it came time for them to look at Steve Banerjee as a potential suspect, he was actually cleared really fast. He was actually at a restaurant across the country when Nick was shot, giving him a rock-solid alibi. And so for a while, the case just kind of went cold. Now that Nick was dead, Steve was able to buy back the touring rights. So he finally had what he wanted, and no one was going to stand in his way now. Plus, no one knew that he was the one responsible for Nick's death. Seriously, for a while, nobody really suspected that he could have been involved in any way. So the first few months after Nick's death, Steve was kind of riding the high. The clubs, the touring, the calendars, everything was making so much money, and now it was all going down. But then things started to get a little rocky at the original Los Angeles club. If you remember earlier, I mentioned the story of Don Gibson, who was discriminated against while trying to get into Chippendales. The issues with that case were starting to resurface, and the fire department was really on their ass because They were constantly breaking the maximum capacity laws. Eventually it got so bad that the Department of Alcoholic Beverage Control ended up revoking their liquor license. And in 1988, the original Chippendales officially closed. So with the LA club shut down, now all that Steve has is the New York club, the calendar, and the touring. But it's all making plenty of money, so he's really not that concerned. But with Steve being Steve, he decided that it wasn't enough. He wanted to take Chippendales overseas. So in 1991, he meets with Carl Leighton Pope, who is a well-known music agent that would have the capacity to make Chippendales a success in London. And just like the New York club and the touring show, Chippendales was an instant success in London. So much so that the show started selling out in less than 3 weeks. It wasn't long before Chippendales was on tour in Europe and performing in places like France, Belgium, Holland, Denmark, and Sweden. Women all across the globe wanted a piece of the Chippendales. And now, with worldwide recognition and growing popularity, they started getting a lot of competitors. There were now other male dancer groups that were performing for crowds of women, and these groups were in no way associated with Chippendales. And Steve, of course, who is a very greedy and jealous person, did not like this. In fact, he saw it as the ultimate threat. And he got especially mad when Chippendale dancers actually started leaving Chippendales to go work for some of these other companies. There was one group in particular called Adonis that was started by former Chippendale dancers, and it became a huge target of Steve. One of the dancers that had left Chippendales to start Adonis was this man named Reed Scott. And at one point, he had been sort of the it guy for Steve because women loved him, they loved his performances, and he was known to bring in a ton of money. So him leaving Chippendales to go dance for Adonis really put a target on his back. So in 1991, Adonis had booked a performance in Blackpool, England. Blackpool is actually a resort town, so they had booked a large venue with a high earning potential. But on the night of the performance, just as the dancers are getting going, they are all told to stop. This was right after the show began, and everyone was really confused. But it turned out a detective from the FBI was there, and he informed the dancers that there had been a threat made against them. They had actually intercepted a call that said there was a contract put on their lives. Specifically, the contract mentioned 3 men, including Reed Scott, that were set to be killed that night via cyanide injection. And even after they were told this, and they were all horrified, the show went on. The whole Adonis group continued to perform that night, knowing that their lives were in danger. Reed said from the beginning he knew that this was being orchestrated by Steve Banerjee, and he ended up starting to sleep with a knife next to his bedside because he was so scared. So it wasn't long after this incident in Blackpool that another FBI agent received a call from one of his informants, who was named Strawberry. And he tells them that he had actually been hired by a man named Ray Cologne to go to Blackpool to poison 3 exotic male dancers with cyanide. Now, Ray Cologne was associated with the mafia, and he met Steve in 1978. And after meeting, Ray sort of became Steve's go-to guy for anything he needed. And this could be something as simple as changing out studio equipment, but he was willing to do much more, including murdering anyone that got in the way of Steve's business.
He gave him an eyedropper bottle full of cyanide, and he told him, this is what you do. You follow him into the men's room, you hit him on the head with a hammer, and then you inject him with the cyanide. So this person, Strawberry, took all this, he flew over there, got cold feet, and he comes back to the United States, and he goes into our office, and that's how we get involved.
So the FBI raid this guy's house in July of 1981, and they find a ton of cyanide. They found 46 grams, which is actually enough to kill 230 people. So obviously Ray was arrested, and after sitting in jail for just 7 months, he decided that he wants to cooperate with law enforcement. The case was being led by FBI agent Scott Garriola. And Ray told Scott and his team about his hit against the Adonis dancers, as well as crucial information about Nick DeNoya's murder. He explained that it was Steve who hired him to take out the Adonis dancers, and it was also Steve who asked him to find someone else to kill Nick DeNoia. So while Ray hadn't been the one to actually pull the trigger on Nick DeNoia, he was the one who hired Gilberto Rivera Lopez to do the job. They also learned that at this point, Gilberto had already gone to prison on an unrelated charge, so he was kind of a lesser concern for that moment. Their main focus was going after Steve and getting a confession on tape. So in order to get this, they decide that they are going to temporarily release Ray Colon so that he can be an undercover informant for them. But obviously Steve was very wary about what he would say, and getting him to admit casually would be very difficult. He was insanely paranoid, and they just knew that there was no way he was going to talk about it or admit anything over the phone. So they end up setting up an in-person meeting. On June 23rd, 1992, Steve and Ray set up a meeting at an IHOP in Santa Monica. And of course, to catch the admission on tape, Ray had to wear a wire that the FBI fastened to his underwear, making it undetectable. However, this meeting was a giant fail. But because of Steve's extreme paranoia, I mean, he felt like the walls were kind of closing in on him, he ended up taking Ray into the bathroom to talk, and he made him strip off all his clothes, so the wire was useless. And then in the bathroom, Steve only communicated with Ray via post-it notes. And anytime Ray would ask a question, Steve would write the answer down, show it to him, then rip it up and flush it right down the toilet. And obviously there is just no way of recovering these notes, so the investigation team was kind of left with nothing. So their next step was to get Ray to meet with Steve again, but this time to keep Steve from being suspicious, which was going to be very hard to do. The issue now was that Steve knew that Ray had been arrested and released. So they kind of had to devise an entirely new story that would put Steve at ease about talking to Ray. His idea was for Ray to pretend that he was released from prison, not to help them out, but to actually get treatments for a terminal issue related to his kidneys. And Ray had actually had issues with his kidneys in the past, so this was especially believable. Then their plan was to have Ray call Steve and tell him that he had escaped from these treatments and was now a fugitive on the run. And in the call, he would tell Steve to meet him overseas in Europe. And surprisingly, this whole thing worked. Steve actually agreed to meet Ray all the way at a hotel in Zurich, Switzerland. And they actually put Ray in a disguise so that it would further the narrative that he was on the run. When Steve showed up at the hotel, he meets Ray at the room that he had rented. But what he didn't know is there was actually FBI agents on either side of that room, listening to everything. But obviously it's a difficult thing. Ray can't just bring up the murders casually right off the bat. He's got to figure out a way to do it casually so that Steve doesn't get suspicious. So he starts just talking about basically anything else, and he is hoping that Steve will just bring it up on his own. So hours go by. The FBI is just listening and recording the whole time, but nothing of importance is said. And the FBI agents were starting to feel a little panicked because at this point it had been 3 hours and they hadn't gotten anything out of him. And to make things even harder, Steve actually at one point said that he didn't trust Ray. And at one point he got up and banged on the hotel walls and said that they were so thin that someone could just be listening to him. So it seemed like he was kind of catching on. But just when they were about to give up, after 4 hours of talking, Steve gave the FBI exactly what they were looking for. He starts talking to Ray about how when he had been arrested, he was curious if they had brought up Nick DeNoia at all, which he called him D. That was their code name for Nick, so that just in case anyone was listening, they wouldn't be able to connect it back, even though it's very obvious. He keeps asking Ray about, what they had asked him regarding D, and specifically, he wants to know if the FBI knew that he was the one who gave Ray the money to buy the gun to kill Nick. So now, with this conversation recorded, the FBI had gotten enough on tape to learn about Steve's complicity in hiring Ray and attempting to kill the Adonis dancers. And that is what stunk Steve Banerjee's ship. He was officially arrested and put behind bars on September 2nd, 1993, where he faced life in prison in addition to a $1.75 million fine. Now, considering how much he makes, this is clearly a low payout, but it was all that they asked for. He was charged on 8 different counts and immediately denied bail because he was considered a flight risk. Steve sat in jail for a few months and eventually decided to make a plea deal with the courts. Steve's friends said that he wanted his freedom more than anything, more than his success, more than the money, more than the Chippendales franchise that he had started. So he said that he would plead guilty to murder and give up his shares in Chippendales in exchange for a lesser sentence. This was a big deal for him. I mean, he was going to be giving up ownership of the Chippendales and the greater parent company, Easby Enterprises Incorporated. But this deal would still require him to serve 26 years in prison. And of course, when people found out about this plea, they were rightfully angry. I mean, he got off very easy. I mean, he had killed someone and plotted to kill many more, but the courts had already agreed to accept his plea, and his sentencing hearing was set to take place on October 24th, 1994. Now, the morning of his sentencing, a lot of people showed up to see this. A lot of people who were very angry with Steve and wanted to see the karma finally hit him. A lot of them were people who were part of the Chippendales family, whether that's just people who worked there or dancers themselves who had felt, victimized by him. They wanted to see him handcuffed and sentenced, even though they felt like the plea was not true justice. So they all arrive at the courthouse waiting for what feels like hours when a man suddenly comes out and tells them casually that there will be no hearing. Everyone was angry, everyone was confused, but then they quickly found out it was because that morning they had discovered Steve Banerjee's body hung in his jail cell by his bedsheet and a coat hanger. Instead of facing the consequences of his actions, Steve took the cowardly way out. He had committed suicide at age 47. There are a few theories about why Steve killed himself. Many people think that the guilt got to him. Some think that he just didn't feel like he could handle prison. And some people think that he just wanted rights to the Chippendales name from the grave, even, in death. And that's how it went. I mean, because Steve killed himself, his assets went to his family instead of the government. And now his family had complete control of the Chippendales empire. So many people think that that's the reason why he did it. Many people think that he was just so desperate for control of the Chippendales that he would rather be dead than see the government take what he had built. So although Chippendales was inherited by the Banerjee family, they ended up selling it off and relinquishing themselves of the responsibility and shame that came along with it. Gilberto Rivera Lopez, who had shot and killed Nick DeNoia on behalf of Steve, was eventually convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to an additional 25 years to life for that crime. Ray Colon, who had actively aided in the FBI's investigation of Steve Banerjee, ended up pleading guilty to conspiracy and murder for hire, but was given a reduced sentence and served 2 years because he had helped them out with Steve. Ray was released in 1996, but remained on house arrest for a while. But even though Chippendales went through a lot of turmoil and a lot of horrific events, the shows themselves have never stopped. It's now owned by someone else, and it still remains very popular. People love the Chippendales show. But I think it's pretty interesting that, most people that go to those shows don't really know the history, don't know all the toxicity that led to the Chippendales being what it is today. I found it to be a very interesting story. I definitely want to hear your thoughts on this one, so leave me a comment and let me know. Let me know if you've ever been to a Chippendales show. I'm curious. Do you think I should go to one? They look fun. But before I go, I would like to thank today's sponsor,
Alrighty, that is it from me. I'm already falling asleep. Let's see. Who is streaming right now? This guy has 0 views? Aww.
So unlucky, man. So unlucky, man.
What's this?
Oi, Steel, turn around, you idiot. Oi! He's too into the game. Me? 16.
What's going on here?
What about you?
Alright, let's just rate JD. Alright, till next time, guys. Have a good day, good night. Ugh.